So, ladies and gentlemen, this is our last session after 9 days here at the New York Times Climate Hub. And I think it's therefore very fitting that we should end this session on reasons to believe, unleashing the power of optimism. Veronica Chambers, a New York Times correspondent, who's based in London, is going to be moderating this last session. And she's going to be leading what I think is a fantastic panel. So once again, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank Morgan Stanley for their support, and we're just going to play a very short video. Thank you.
I'm Audrey Choi, Chief Sustainability Officer at Morgan Stanley and CEO of the Institute for Sustainable Investing. Welcome to the New York Times Climate Hub, taking place alongside COP26. The health of our planet is now the existential issue for business leaders and government leaders alike. The important conversations happening here in Glasgow are a critical catalyst for the actions we need to take to stem the long-term effects of climate change. Clearly, the time for action is now. To begin, I'd like to share with you some of our best thinking on one of the topics we're here to discuss. Thank you, and enjoy the session.
60% of carbon emissions comes from energy, and this is a key area where we can focus on reducing emissions by using technology. I'm Jessica Alsford, Head of Global Sustainability Research at Morgan Stanley. The 5 key technologies that are needed to decarbonise energy are renewables, electric vehicles, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and biofuels. Many of these decarbonisation technologies are commercially viable today. Renewables are really exciting because actually you've seen a huge decrease in the cost over the last decade or so. And so now in many regions, they're actually much cheaper than the fossil fuel equivalent. We see attractive investment opportunities across many of these 5 technologies. Some are earlier short-term opportunities, some are longer term, but all have a real role to play in investment decisions. I'm Jessica Alsford, and we are Morgan Stanley.
Hello, everybody. We're really excited to be here. It's the last panel. I'm going to introduce us all, and I'm Veronica Chambers. I'm Narrative Projects Editor for the New York Times. To my left is Elizabeth Wathuti, who joins us from Kenya. She's the founder of the Green Generation Initiative and is serving as the Global South Youth Co-Chair for the COP26 Civil Society and Youth Advisory Council. Welcome, Elizabeth. And we're going to hear more about your work. I'm really excited. Joining us on screen is Dr. Catherine Wilkinson. She's an acclaimed author, strategist, and teacher. She's co-founder of the All We Can Save project in support of women leading climate. She's co-host of the podcast A Matter of Degrees, and her books include the amazing anthology All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. Welcome, Catherine.
Hi, everyone.
To my right, we have Bruno Rodríguez. He's the founder of Youth for Climate. Did I hear a woo-woo? Okay, your people are here. Is the founder of Youth for Climate Argentina and a member of the Generation Climate Initiative. From the age of 14, Bruno has worked in some of the poorest neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, helping communities impacted by extreme floods and heat waves, and amplifying the demands of indigenous people from the provinces where he was born. Welcome, Bruno. Bienvenido. Vamos a hablar en español y en inglés, and that's one of our topics, is kind of diversifying the language we're using in talking about climate change. Last but certainly not least, we have Simon Mundy, who is the moral money editor for the Financial Times, where he covers environmental and sustainability questions. He traveled to 6 continents to research his brand new book, Race for Tomorrow: Survival, Innovation, and Profit on the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis. Welcome, Simon. So this topic is, I think, really appropriate for the last day. I'm just going to ask for a show of hands. how many people are feeling optimistic at the end of these 2 weeks? A few? Okay. Well, you know, when we dig into the science, we know it can seem devastating and overwhelming. Catherine, can you kick us off by talking about how we work with climate emotions?
Absolutely. Thanks, Veronica. So I think one of the things to think about is sort of what is optimism, right? Whether that is a feeling that we have to have every day to do this work. I certainly don't have it every day. Or as my friend Bina Venkatraman likes to say, it's a state of engagement with rather than retreat from the future. And I really like that because I think that means all of our feelings are welcome as long as we are sort of staying oriented to possibility. And in my experience of doing climate work now for over 2 decades, we have to create space for feeling that devastation and overwhelm that you described, Victoria, for feeling grief, for feeling rage. And I think when we work with those emotions consciously rather than suppressing them, they can become fuel for the work, right? Rather than sort of keeping us paralyzed. And I think it's okay, right? That we don't actually feel hopeful or feel optimistic all the time or every day, but that we keep stepping into the work. There are actually a curated list of resources for working with climate emotions on our website of the All We Can Save project, which is allwecansave.earth, for folks who are maybe looking for a little bit more support there.
That's great. Thank you. Elizabeth, you and I were talking backstage about dealing with emotions. You've been here for 2 weeks. You've been in the thick of it. Can you talk about how you keep optimism going and how exhaustion is part and parcel of the work?
Sure. And we're having this conversation at a time when Avaz has also revealed that 75% of young people are living in fear of the future caused by the climate crisis. And just being at the COP for the past days, I would confess, has been so overwhelming. It's been a lot trying to get your voices heard, and at the end of the day, we still feel as though we are not being listened to. And it can be really difficult for a young person who really understands what is happening on the ground back in our communities. And I remember we had this press conference yesterday, and I was asking, what are we going to tell the people back in our communities whose lives and livelihoods are in balance when it comes to the decisions that are being made at COP26. And I have always found strength in holding on to what I love, and that is the people and the planet, because many people tell us that we should be hopeful, but I think what young people need more than hope right now is action. Because whatever it is that we are trying to fight for right now is definitely going to be realized if urgent and immediate action is taken to address the climate crisis. And every time I feel overwhelmed, I also draw so much inspiration from the late Professor Wangari Maathai, because she was the type of courageous leader who did not stand powerless in the face of overwhelming challenges. And she always stood her ground. And allow me to share with you one of her guiding lights. That was the story of the hummingbird. She talked of a forest that was consumed by a big fire, and all the animals in the forest were feeling overwhelmed, feeling hopeless, feeling powerless, and they all moved to the other side of a stream that was in the forest. And they are all standing there feeling powerless because their only home is being destroyed, which is the situation that the world is in right now, except for this tiny little hummingbird that decides that it's going to do something about the fire. And it decides to fly to the stream and picks a drop of water, flies to the forest over and over 1,000,000 times, trying to put the fire out. And at this time, all the other animals on the other side are looking at the hummingbird and asking the bird, what do you think you can do? You're a tiny bird, you have just a tiny beak, your wings are too little, there's nothing that you can do. And this bird looks at the other animals, much bigger animals like the elephant that has a huge trunk that can fetch so much water to help with the fire. And it tells the other animals, I love this forest and I am doing the best that I can. And to me, that is what most of the people, the young people, the communities are doing, being the hummingbirds. But we have to remember that the world leaders are not hummingbirds in this case, because they have more capacity and they have a lot of resources to do more than what we can do as, you know, the entire human race. And it's just up to us to step up and do the best that we can to remind them that, you know, we are not the hummingbirds. We are doing the best that we can, and it's up to you to also step up and do what must be done. And I think for me, that is strength, knowing that I'm doing the best that I can for my people and doing the best that I can to protect the planet and nature and everything that I have always known as a child as my home.
Love it. Yeah, thank you. Bruno, you're in a similar sort of situation as Liz. How has this COP been for you? Where's your optimism right now? And what is the message do you feel that you're carrying back to your communities?
Well, right now, COP26 has shown us that really if the international community does not meet the challenge of this historical moment, which is to face the climate and ecological crisis with concrete action, then not only the present of the most vulnerable populations is at stake, but the future of my generation, of the generations to come, is totally sold out. So I believe that indeed the importance of this COP is to build a sense of universal solidarity between the peoples of the world. Because right now I think that sometimes we see that the solutions of the climate and ecological crisis will only come through technological changes and the reconfiguration of the market. But the very heart of the solutions will come from standing together at the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced. Because the changes that we need to introduce they are not only related with technology or with some economic measures. They are systemic changes. It is about ending colonialism. It is about ending with lots of systems of injustice, of social injustice. So I believe that that as well can be a very important tool for deepening our sense of hope.
Thank you. Thank you. Simon, you just published a book in which you've traveled around the world looking at these issues. Where did you find optimism, and where do you find the interconnectedness that Bruno and Liz are talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to define optimism. I would say, insofar as I'm optimistic, it involves two things. One, recognizing the challenge that we have. So recognizing it's extremely serious. I mean, I saw things on my travels that were extremely serious. Also recognizing that it's hard. If you listen to some people in business, you'd think we're already on track, or at least you'd think that some of the biggest companies in the world are already on the track. I don't think any of us are on track. It's hard. As Bruno just said, we need to think about updating and really transforming the whole system within which we operate. Things like proper global carbon pricing are going to be essential, and that's hard. That means changing the whole fabric of capitalism, but we are changing the whole fabric of our physical planet. So that would not be an overreaction, in my opinion. In terms of where I saw scope for optimism during my travels, I think the point is that people are taking action all over the world. You know, there are 26 countries that I had the privilege to visit for this book and to meet the people who are making those responses. People in their very different ways. There are people who are fighting to protect their communities, to adapt to the physical impacts of climate change that I encountered in places as far afield as Bangladesh and Solomon Islands. Technology is also going to help us. As Bruno said, we can't simply bank on some future technology emerging, but it's true that some forms of technology that are now being developed are going to be useful. And so I met some extraordinary examples of that, some extraordinary examples of people who are developing such technology on my travels. But I think in order to really address these problems, and for me to really be optimistic going forward, I would really echo the points that are actually made by all three of the other panelists, that we need to make sure that we are approaching this as a human race and not with our own individual interests or national interests. We need to recognize that this is all interconnected. If the rich countries allow the poor countries to fall into terrible physical and economic and humanitarian crisis, there are going to be knock-on effects. If you have huge streams of climate refugees, think about what that means for political discourse in Europe and in North America. Think about the rise of the extreme right that we're already seeing and how they have already been feeding upon fears of climate refugees. They have already been doing this with regard to refugees from Syria and so on. So it affects all of us, and I think we all have to frankly treat it with the urgency that it deserves.
Thank you. Catherine, I know that equity in this work has been central to your research and to your writing and everything. Can you talk about equity and justice and how it plays into what's practical and possible?
Sure. Well, I think there is no way to understand the climate crisis except as kind of the greatest injustice at work on this planet, across present generations, across generations yet to come, across species, in every way, right? And yet when we think about how much of the public discourse about the climate crisis has been constructed by thinkers and voices that are predominantly male, predominantly white, predominantly global north, I think it has left us with a very limited set of lenses for understanding the problem and for how we think about solutions, right? What counts as a solution? Who decides? Who benefits? All of these questions. And one of the things that has really informed our work with All We Can Say of the anthology and carrying forward is that it takes a kaleidoscope to see the climate crisis clearly. And that means having a much different set of voices, I think, shaping our conversation, because so much of what we think of as being possible or impossible, right or wrong, gets constructed in culture and discourse and storytelling first. And so to me, that's a piece that is at the heart of things. And obviously our work looks specifically at how we do a better job of centering the work and wisdom of women, folks who identify as women. And that's not just sort of something that sounds like a nice idea or is fair, but we actually have a growing body of research that shows us that climate outcomes are manifestly better from the local level through to global negotiations when women are equally represented, present, and leading. So this is not just kind of a matter of something that sounds good. It is a critical strategy, I think, for arriving at a just and livable future.
Okay, thank you. Liz, I'd like to ask you, because you're here as a youth delegate, and yet, as we were talking about, when you go back home, you're also a leader for younger people than you. Can you talk about your two different roles, like being a youth delegate here and being a leader back home, and how you toggle between them and what they require, what both roles require of you?
Yes, I have focused on activism and also working with children. And one of the things that I have discovered from children as well is the issue of eco-anxiety, where most of them are definitely really afraid of how the future is going to look like. But again, I've also discovered a population that is so passionate about the environment and that wants to see immediate action. And one of the things and an art that I've learned in the process is how to acknowledge my feelings about what's happening around me and how to turn those feelings and reactions into action. Because as a child, I did experience ecological grief where trees that we planted as children were cut down, and we walk into this forest and find tree logs and tree stumps, and I could not understand why anyone would destroy such a beautiful forest that I loved so much. And that was the turning point for me, because I felt so angry, but then I decided to turn that anger into a hunger to want to do something about challenges like deforestation and the climate crisis. And along the way, I've also been working with children to protect urban green spaces in Nairobi. And I do remember, again, facing a similar situation where we were hanging love hearts to trees in the city that had been marked for felling with children. And our hopes were that they would protect the trees and let them live. But 2 weeks after, again, we found tree stumps, and we could not understand why people do not share the same feelings and deep sense of humanity and understanding that we are nature and we have to protect nature. So working with children has always kept me going, because they really want to see change happen. And the children are doing the best that they can to be able to change the environment, to change their schools, to change their countries. And one of the things that I've really been focusing on with children is a symbol of just growing trees with them in their school compound. But again, these children are, their efforts are being undermined, because when they're planting trees on one side of the school compound, they see whole networks of trees being cleared and destroyed on the other side of the school compound. And I think it's about how do we make sure that they continue to take action and they continue to do the best that they can without feeling that their efforts are being undermined. So I would say it has been a two-way learning of the fact that, yes, the children want to do the best that they can, but they cannot continue to hold on to that same optimism if the big corporations and governments continue to, for example, fuel deforestation or continue to put their lives at risk. They want to breathe clean air, they want food, they want water. And all of these efforts are only going to be made possible if every person is going to do what must be done on their end. And the big responsibility must not be left to them, because young people are the ones who will have to live longer with the consequences of the world's inaction today and the consequence of every wrong decision and action that is going to be made today. But they do not have to be the ones bearing the brunt of the climate crisis or even the ones carrying the biggest burden. They should be protecting the environment because they love the environment, but not because someone is trying to destroy what they know as nature and the environment. So I think the most important thing is for us to change what is it that we are putting our children and our young people into? What are they deeply rooted into? Is it the love for people and nature, or are we forcing them to do this because we are trying to take away their future? Yeah.
It's a great question. Bruno, so many of the major conversations around climate and media and policy seem to be happening in English. Is this an issue, and how do we address that?
It is a great issue, I would say. I'm from Argentina, and by that I am familiar with the context of permanent uncertainty and even in some cases despair, because we live cyclical economic crises. And this reality for us puts us in a position in which we are obliged to question everything and to create new radical narratives which go to the bottom of the problems. Here at COP, for example, we do not only discuss about the importance of reconfiguring carbon markets and technical issues regarding the climate and ecological crisis, but also the ways in which, for example, climate affects the quality of democracy and the barriers of language, for example, gives us this image of profound inequalities which derive in a more deteriorated democracy, global democracy. So of course it is a barrier. And I just wanted to say something about what just Liz mentioned, because I think it's the central key of the problem. Mm-hmm. Right now we're talking about optimism. We're talking about how can we unleash the power of being hopeful in this great catastrophe, in this great emergency that we're living. First of all, I think that we need to assume that it is very comfortable sometimes to stay in a position in which we assume that the climate and ecological scenario is an inevitable one. It's completely inevitable. It's very comfortable. But on the other hand, I believe that thinking about the possibility of creating a new world through an eco-social transition is the best decision that we can make in this historical moment, and it is uncomfortable. And we need to embrace that sensation of being uncomfortable, fighting climate change. Because if not, we're going to stay in a box in which changes are not going to happen. So being from Argentina and living this context of permanent crisis, I think that we have a lot to say in these global discussions. Solutions in the global scale, in the international policy scenario, have to come through the exchange and the solidarity between countries. But I think that particularly in this moment, solutions must come from the peoples in the global south. That's the key that we need to embrace. If our north becomes the south, then I think we will have a clearer path to get away from this crisis.
That's powerful. Thank you.
Simon, something that we've talked about and you mentioned is the kind of myth of resiliency that we sometimes, especially I think in the media, give communities of color. Can you talk about the way that that undermines actual agency, power, action, and change?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important and uncomfortable issue. So you'll often see the word resilient used about people in vulnerable communities, both in developing countries, as well as in places like Louisiana, which is where this quote came from that I mentioned to you. And it's a quote from an activist called Tracy Washington in Louisiana, I think in New Orleans after Katrina. And she said, "Don't call me resilient, because when you call me resilient, it means you can do something else to me. I am not resilient." That's a very uncomfortable thing to think about, isn't it? Because we often talk about people in vulnerable communities. We say, "I admire them so much, they're so resilient." And having traveled to some of these communities, quite a lot of them for my project, it's awkward because I do admire them. I mean, a lot of them are really tough people, like in Mongolia, where people are living in minus 30 degrees and the winters are getting more extreme because of the accelerating ice melt in the Arctic. They're a lot tougher than me, and I respect that and I admire that. But we shouldn't romanticize poverty. We shouldn't romanticize hardship and suffering that millions of people are going through in the world. And something that another thing we were talking about earlier is the issue of representation, and other panelists have talked about it here. It's key. And I'm very conscious as yet another posh white man that there's not a shortage of people like me giving their opinions about things, and that's something I'm very conscious of. Something that I tried to do in the project was to sort of hijack that privileged position that I have to give a platform for people, the many people I met who don't get that platform. And none of those people are here in Glasgow. And I think we can all think about, Liz and I were talking earlier about how can COP27 and COP28 and COP29 and COP30 be better than COP26. And I think one of the key things that we need to think about addressing is how do we better represent the majority of people on the planet who earn a few $1,000s a year or less. There are very few of them here in Glasgow. We have, and thank God, we do have a decent number of people from developing countries, and even they are not here in sufficient numbers. And you tend to have, the people who are really the poorest people in the world. We have very, very few of them. So I think one thing that's been really exciting to see is the use that we can make of video link technology. So we've got Catherine here today, for example, and it's brilliant. We can bring in people who aren't able to be here physically in person. And I hope that organizers of this event and organizers of COP27, the main COP organizers, will think, now that everyone's using Zoom, now that even in the poorest countries, we have access to high-speed internet. Even if you're a very poor person, there will be a city, at least there will be a city somewhere nearby with a hotel that has high-speed internet. So you can bring these people into the conversation. And it's so important because the rules of the economic system that we live in are being rethought right now. And that conversation is being shaped very heavily by big business people who are here in huge numbers here in Glasgow. Now, I'm not condemning that. I think it shows that they are now engaging seriously with climate change as an issue, so that's good. But I think we have a problem with the way in which the broader conversation is being shaped to an excessive degree by big business and not sufficiently by the majority of the people in the world who, by the standards of the West, are poor. And I hope that will be addressed better in future COPs.
Thank you. Catherine, I wanted to ask you, and I want to get to questions soon, so this will be like the last round robin. What is the low-hanging fruit when we think of solutions? What's scalable and possible now?
Well, this was something I thought a lot about for a number of years in my work at Project Drawdown, which, if folks aren't familiar, is a nonprofit that focuses on kind of synthesizing the world's climate solutions. Not someday, maybe, if we're lucky and some Silicon Valley bros sort it out, but practices and technologies that are already in hand, they're already working, and we have enough data about them to understand kind of what contribution could they make. And I also just want to pick up on something that Bruno said about the importance of the solutions conversation being led by people from the global south, from frontline and impacted communities, in national conversations like the one we've been heavily in the U.S. this fall. But so many of the solutions that we need are already in hand, whether that is solutions to get to 100% clean electricity, to retrofitting and electrifying our buildings, to more regenerative approaches to agriculture. There's so much that is possible, and it's part of why I found myself sort of a little bit scratching my head with the opening video and the emphasis on carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and biofuels, which are not present in the Project Drawdown research if you go take a look at that, because there is so much that is unproven and there is so much that is not actually climate positive in those quote unquote solutions. So I think we need to be focusing on genuine solutions and really thinking about the solutions that have the most kind of concurrent, right, what climate wonky people call co-benefits, right, which is just to say the solutions that meet the needs of people and communities here and now at the same time that we solve for this problem of heat trapping pollution in our atmosphere. And I would also just say, I think one of the things that has happened over the course of the pandemic is expanding what we think about when we're talking about climate solutions. It's been really exciting to me to see the advances in the conversation around the care economy and care infrastructure as part of what it will take to have a life-giving future, not just one with lower emissions, but one in which we are genuinely thriving together. And I suppose, maybe most of all, the solutions that I think we need are really human solutions. We clearly have a lot of tools in our toolbox, but there is still very much a leadership crisis at the heart of the climate crisis. And there are people with power and influence today, institutions with power and influence today, that need to be doing much more than they are doing. So I would like us to be scaling genuine courage and collaboration just as much as we're scaling solar panels and no-till agriculture.
Thank you, Catherine. Bruno, what do you want to see people scaling? What do you want people leaving here thinking about?
I want people to start believing in the importance of collective action in a way that we have never seen before. I think that Catherine also in that statement went to the bottom of the problem and to the bottom of the solutions as well. bringing Argentina again to the table and Latin America again to the table, I think that the story of our people is the story of social resistance. Right now for us, in the COP, for example, trying to be inside the negotiating rooms, for us the heart of the climate crisis and the most important impacts are related with a system of financial subjugation because of our external debt with international organisms. Because we need to be more intense in productive activities which are environmentally depredatory in order to gain payment capacity for us to be able to fulfill our commitments with our financial debts. And for us, that is one key of the problem, the financial debt, but we also need the global north, for example, to recognize the existence of the ecological debt that they contracted with the south. And going, for example, not only to a scale of systemic change of collective action, go into an individual scale. I ask the people of the global north, the society of the global north, to see how, for example, their own consumption patterns and their style lives are maintained, are sustained by the exploitations of our territories. It is a system of domination. And there is no time, there is a phrase that I really like, that I once heard, and it says, fear is always with us, but we just don't have time for it, not now. And I think that is the path that we need to walk on. And one other thing that I think that it's very, very emotional for me and extremely motivating for the organization in which I'm involved, which is part of the Fridays for Future international movement, was said by an assassinated writer in Argentina, Héctor Germano Estergel, who wrote a very, very important political comic, which was The Eternaut. I really recommend that, who said, the only valid hero is the collective hero, is the human group hero. This, without previous intention, reflects my deepest feeling. The only valid hero is the group hero, never the individual group hero, never the lonely hero.
Love that. Thank you. I want to go to questions soon because we only have a few minutes left. But Liz, I just was wondering if you wanted to just end this part of the session with telling us what feels possible to you now, emotionally, intellectually, collectively.
So we have known for ages what needs to be done, and we're not reinventing any new wheel. It has been all about the broken promises which we cannot continue to rely on. And so if there's one thing that I would like you to live with is, I do not want you to lean on hope, because hope is meaningless if it's not followed by action. Instead, I want you to lean on love for the people and our planet, because if you feel the injustices and the heartbreaks that have gone into the climate crisis, then you will develop a natural call to action, and you will also be on the front lines to make sure that the voices of people who are not here with us today will be heard, and that their lives and livelihoods will not continue to be unbalanced. And I know that we have been failed in the past. We are still being failed right now. And if the leaders continue to fail us in the future, I think we, the people with the open hearts, are the ones that are going to make change happen, and they will have no choice but to let the people power lead the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Do we have questions in the audience? Are there? And please try to keep questions brief so we can get to at least a few. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jack. Thank you guys for such an insightful discussion. The question I'd like to ask is to each of the panelists really, is how you guys feel being included at this event, given that the New York Times continues to advertise for ExxonMobil, and that Morgan Stanley is one of the lead sponsors of this climate hub, who have invested over $100 billion since the signing of the Paris Agreement. And I want to be clear that I'm asking this question not from a place of criticizing any individual, but rather from a place of not allowing this hypocrisy to go on in silence, and perhaps allowing each of the panelists to comment on the impact of allowing some of the corporations which have been most responsible for driving climate chaos to be included in spaces which should be about discussing climate solutions.
Thank you. Yep. Can I ask Simon and Bruno to answer that, just so that we can have some room for other questions? I hear you and I appreciate you making the comment.
No, I think Bruno wanted to.
Okay.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's
Can we
very
both?
brief.
You guys can both go,
And Liz and Cathy.
we'll take another question.
Very, very brief. I think that once again we come back to the issue about being comfortable. It's obviously uncomfortable to participate in spaces where sometimes maybe private entities participate as well, and we see them as only spaces granted for those voices. But if we have the opportunity to speak about our solutions, about our perspectives from the global south, in those same spaces, I think that we need to embrace that uncomfortable sensation of giving that battle. And that's why I believe it's important to participate in these events. It's important to make our voices to be heard in all the spaces without selecting. So I think that's my answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Simon?
Do you want to say something? Okay. Well, it's something I think about a lot, this sort of thing, because it's not just the New York Times. Also, my employer, the Financial Times, has advertising from energy companies, many of which make a lot of money from fossil fuels. So the fossil fuel company makes money from fossil fuels, which have a terrible impact on the planet. Some of that money goes to my employer and some of that goes to me. Now, you could say that the New York Times, for example, should stop taking money for advertising from fossil fuel companies. You would then say, for example, what about a company that has second-order exposure to fossil fuels, a bank, for example? What about another company that has exposure to that bank? We're all touched by this, and I agree that there's a definite danger of hypocrisy, and perhaps it's difficult to point fingers at others, as long as the system is so deeply flawed as the system that we have. We all benefit in some ways from the current system, at least if we live in the rich country. If you have an income that's above a few $1,000s a year, you are a beneficiary of the current system. And that certainly includes me, and I think everyone in this room, actually, or most of the people in this room, I would have thought. So until we change the system, there's just going to be an endless number of awkward situations like this. As you say, this money is partly funded by companies that are making money indirectly or directly from fossil fuels. For me, the response is, how can we change the system? I chose to speak at this event because I think it's a really important conversation to be having, and I have stories to share. It's not so much my stories, it's just things that I learned on my travels. And I want to take every opportunity that I can personally. I recognize how privileged I am to have an opportunity to be here on a stage talking to people, a room full of people that's being live streamed. So I want to use that opportunity to make some small contribution towards that conversation, which may eventually, I hope, end up with an improvement to the system. So that's my personal motivation for taking part.
I just want to make sure before we go to the next question, Liz or Catherine, did you want to address this, or are you okay to go to the next question? Feel free.
I just wanted to add in quickly, I do think that media organizations have a particular responsibility because there is real public confusion when you have great climate reporting as an outlet like the New York Times has, and then you have a brand studio that's creating greenwashing content for fossil fuel companies. It's no wonder the public are not clear on what the sources of this crisis are and what needs to be done to address it. And I think that there's a lot of rumbling to be done, and a lot of lines that really should be drawn and haven't been drawn yet. I'm an admirer of what The Guardian has done on this front. But I think it's a really important question and topic, and I think I land somewhere similar to Bruno around, coming to, most climate conversations are fraught in some way, and trying to anchor in truth as well as we can suss it out, and bringing that forward is really important.
Thank you, Catherine. Liz?
And for me as well, what's really important is to have that platform to speak up for the people who are not here with us today. But again, it's important that we don't get blinded or allow the climate lies to take over. And I think from what has been mentioned, I think every person would really be happy if the New York Times does the right adverts that support the climate movement. Yeah.
Thank you. Good topic. Is there another question from the audience? We've got a phenomenal panel. Maybe, I think someone's handing out mics. Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Natasha from the Philippines. I've actually been working with frontline communities since I was 12. So it's a complete privilege to be here. And I just wanted to ask, from your first-hand experience working with frontline communities as well, one of the biggest challenges we've seen is educating people about the climate crisis when they're hungry. So what do you think is the best way to address this issue? Thank you.
Thank you. This is something that we've talked about. Do you want to talk about this, Bruno? And then Liz, do you want to jump in? Or any panelist can jump in. I'm just trying to think about the conversations we've had off stage about this.
Also, very brief, there is a current debate in Argentina, but I think it's a worldwide debate, which is related with the supposed contradiction between economic development and taking action on climate. If we divide that debate in the different shapes that it has, for example, if we go to what the necessities of the most vulnerable sectors, for example, in Argentina are, and you talk to the people who work in the territory where those injustices are being materialized, you will see that sometimes the answer to the question about the environmental importance of taking climate action is like, we first gotta eat. We need to eat first. That's our priority. Then the contamination and the issues related to climate change will go, then we will address them. But I think that it is very important that we acknowledge that the coincidence between the maps of poverty and environmental degradation are extremely real, specifically in Latin America, specifically in Africa, for example, and being, for example, in one of the largest organizations in Argentina that work in territory that's called the powerful La Poderosa, for a couple of months, I've seen that taking climate action and being involved in the environmental movement is becoming a historical imperative for our generation, and specifically in those places where we don't have to educate, we need to be educated. We need to be educated by the experiences of those peoples, by the experiences of the social movements which work in those territories. And so I think that we need to invert the question and ask ourselves, what can we learn from the most vulnerable?
Thank you.
And I think to just add on to your point, it's important to also tell the right stories of these marginalized communities, because they are not just bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, but they are also every day working on solutions that support their livelihoods and their everyday today living. I come from Kenya, where there's currently drought that has been declared a national disaster. But again, some of the women and communities in these places where drought has been declared a national disaster, they are every day working for solutions and every day trying to even find out what kind of crops can we grow that are drought resistant. And they are organizing, mobilizing, and coming together to find solutions, to find food for their children, to find water for their families. And I think it's important that we begin to highlight the real stories of the grassroots communities, because they are the people that are doing the work on the ground that we keep talking about every day. But again, they are not able to scale up some of their initiatives because we are still not bringing them on the front lines of the solutions, because we feel as though the solutions can only come from big corporations or the governments, and yet these people have been doing the work for years and ages, but they are not still yet at the decision-making tables, and their solutions and the initiatives still do not get the amount of support that they require to have. So I think it's important that we also, that's why it's also about like uprooting the system. Who is benefiting from the climate finance that we talk about every day? Who is benefiting from some of the key things that we're talking about every day? Who are the real people that we are supporting in the climate movement? They are affected, but they are working on solutions. I think our eyes and resources should be going to those people that are doing the real work on the ground.
Thank you. I think we can take one more question. It's an incredible panel, so I want to give people the chance.
Hi, thank you for the panel. My name is Pau Torres Pagès. I'm a journalist in El Diari de Barcelona. And during this panel, the term eco-anxiety was used. And I think it's quite important. And I know that back in Catalonia, where I'm from, some people made fun of that term as if it wasn't really an issue or if it was something that you can diminish. Could you please talk about it a little bit more and tell us why is it important to take it seriously? Thank you.
Who would like to answer? Liz?
Yeah,
And then maybe Catherine?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think it's really important that we acknowledge the kind of situation that we've put most young people and the children into. And it is important that people don't also joke about eco-anxiety, because a lot of young people, like I mentioned, there's a 75% of the population of young people from a verse is that they are feeling afraid of how the future is going to look like, because it's already disastrous right now. And hundreds and thousands of young people are crying, demanding for action, and still they do not see that happening every day. So the worries keep on increasing day by day. But I think what is important is for us to acknowledge that, yes, there's worry about how the future is going to look like. And then we need to move beyond how we feel about the situation and help, the young people and the children as well to use that as a way to reactivate and, it's a way to give more strength to them to continue to take action. Because many other times, like I've mentioned, I have felt the pain of trying to protect the environment, but on the other hand, people who have big power, big corporations are trying to undermine the efforts that we try to do every day. And it's really painful, it's heartbreaking to just know that nobody appreciates the love that you're giving to the planet and the world. And I think what's really important now is how do we turn our reactions into action and activate a growing mass movement of people to continue in the same energy of wanting something better for the planet. So I think it's about moving beyond how we feel about what's happening and turning our feelings into getting more energized to step up and do more that's supposed to be done. Because I think the more we get a more growing mass movement of people who understand, people who feel it in themselves about what's happening to the world, then that revolution is definitely going to help us get to where we want to be. But we cannot afford to say that it's not existing, but it's a reality. And I just want to end with a quote that says, those of us who understand and who feel strongly must not tire, and we must not give up, because the burden is on us who know, and those who don't know are at peace. It is us who know that get disturbed and are caused to take action. So if we take the context in that way, that we are being disturbed, and it's okay to feel disturbed, but then we have to step up and be the voices of change, because without us who feel disturbed stepping up, then nobody else is going to step up. And that was a quote from the late Professor Ngare Maathai as well.
Thank you for that. Before we close out, I want to just echo how much Bruno talking about becoming comfortable with our discomfort, being disturbed, all of this being part of the work and how important that is. Catherine, do you want to close us out by addressing this issue? Because I know it's something you've thought and worked a lot about.
Sure. Well, I think, we are profoundly connected with one another, with the living systems of this planet, with what we might think of as sort of the beating heart of Earth. And so, of course, we are feeling the pain of what is unfolding, right? If we have our eyes open, it would be a very strange thing to have no emotional response to that. And so I think honoring that emotional response as something that is normal and healthy, and it is part of being, you know, one node in this incredible web of life on this planet, and supporting one another in that, right? Taking that as information, as Liz is saying, as fuel to catalyze more action, and to not hold it alone, right? I think what we know is that so many people are feeling this. Grist reported in October that Google searches of eco-anxiety had jumped 565% in 12 months. So this is happening, right? People are feeling this. How do we use that as a source of connection and further action rather than something that keeps people isolated and paralyzed? And I think in picking up on something Simon said, you know, there are real concerns also about the rise of eco-fascism in the global north. And so meeting these anxieties with compassion, but also with sort of justice at the core, I think is really important, so that we don't sort of have this circulating through society and coming out in really damaging ways. And for me, you know, at the end of the day, when I was thinking about this topic of optimism, you know, I often return to thinking about life force, and that there's this like fundamental truth on this planet that for 3.8 billion years, life has kind of barreled forward to more life, despite the odds. And that is the most powerful dynamic on this planet. It is literally our inheritance. And I think the work is also to make it our legacy, for humans writ large to be helpers and part of life force. And so I think eco-anxiety to me is one little message that's sort of calling people into that work.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, Simon, Elizabeth, Bruno. To life and more life force. Thank you all for coming.